I'd like to thank Mandy, first of all, and the Kenyon Institute for having me. Thank you very much. The paper I'm going to discuss was given originally at the CATA conference at the Aarhus in Denmark in June, a couple months ago. It was very well received. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to present some of the findings to you. Okay, first of all, a couple of words about the Panopticon. One of the most common comments that I hear about the papers that they had to run and look up what the Panopticon was exactly in order to understand it. The Panopticon's undergone evolution since it was conceived by Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. It looks something like this. Okay, this was a prison that was built on Jeremy Bentham's model in South America. The idea here is, and the reason why I brought the pictures to show you what he conceived the Panopticon as an institution where the prisoners or the inmates were in clear cells. Okay, they could be observed 24 hours a day without any kind of technology, cameras or anything like that. They could be directly observed by the guards that were in a circular tower. Okay, the guards could see out, but you couldn't see in. Okay, and the idea for Jeremy Bentham, he wasn't a bad person. He was trying actually to better the lives of prisoners and to prepare them for normalized life in society. In other words, change their behavior. Okay, by this constant observation. So the point here is that constant observation will lead to change in behavior. Okay, and he described it then as a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind in a quantity hitherto without example. It's just not one-to-one. You can do this with a large quantity of people. Okay. Foucault took Bentham's concept of Panopticon and also addressed it, but he didn't see it necessarily as an architectural construct. It wasn't a physical construct. He saw it as aspects of society which function as a Panopticon. Okay, and watch us and direct our behavior. And the major effect of the Panopticon, according to Foucault, is to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures automatic functioning of power. Okay, that's very, very, we accept the function of power automatically and naturally. Manuel de Landa in 1991 takes the concept of Panopticon and extends it even further to what he calls a panspectrum. Okay, instead of positioning some human bodies around the central sensor, and if we talk about architecture, it would be that tower in the middle. If we're talking about technology, it's cameras, monitoring the internet, the electromagnetic spectrum, etc. So instead of positioning some human bodies around the central sensor, a multiplicity of sensors is deployed around all bodies. Its antenna farms spy satellites, and cable traffic intercepts feed into its computers all the information that can be gathered. The panspectron does not merely select certain bodies and certain visual data about them, rather it compiles information about all at the same time, using computers to select the segments of data relevant to its surveillance tasks. Now, de Landa was talking about a theoretical construct. This didn't exist then in 1991 when he spoke about it. But apparently some people at the Office of Information Awareness in the United States were paying close attention to both Panopticon, to both Foucault and de Landa when they conceptualized this structure, okay, implementing this structure in democratic states. In other words, we collect transactional information, biometric information of our citizens, face, fingerprints, gaits, irises, transactional data across the board. I'm not going to bore you with PowerPoint karaoke. Okay. This goes into supposedly private and secure data repositories, which are then examined by multi-agency intelligence agencies and stuff like that. And they can use algorithms, etc., to possibly even predict behavior. Okay, so because they're dealing with large amounts of information. Okay, so this is so these are all theoretical concepts. So by the way, this disappeared. Okay, I found that this is the only thing that exists at the Office of Information Awareness on the internet. You can find this gift. The office was closed down in 2003, 2004. Okay, because of public criticism. All of these projects, though, apparently have been outsourced to different agencies within the American government. So it's not as if the panspectron disappeared. It's just not under the auspices of the Office of Information Awareness. Okay, and this is where I think we are today for the most part. And all countries are doing this. They're trying to create something similar to the Penn spectrum. You see this in the UK to a large extent, especially with the use of CCTV cameras. They backed away from a biometric database, but that's also in the makings. And almost all of the liberal democracies today are developing frameworks that are similar to this in some way. It's not only, you don't need to see the Gaza Strip. I'm sure everyone here is aware of the Gaza Strip in terms of where it's situated. My colleagues here, we get most of the Qassam rockets, or a lot of the Qassam rockets that are fired from Gaza. Okay, the Gaza Strip itself lies on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. It's bordered on the southwest by Egypt, by Israel on the east, in the east and the north. The strip itself is 41 kilometers long and between 6 and 12 kilometers wide. Its total area is 360 square kilometers and contains a population of approximately 1.7 million, most of whom are refugees. It's also one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Actually, the whole idea of Panopticon, colonialism, control of colonial subjects, these things seem to meld together almost seamlessly. One of the most powerful strategies of imperial dominance is that of surveillance or observation, because it implies a viewer with an elevated vantage point. And if you notice, especially British architecture in the Middle East, or in general, the police stations, garrisons, military bases, we're all placed at elevated vantage points or at crossroads, okay, for control. Okay, so just the power to process and understand that which is seen, and that objectifies and interpolates the colonized subject in a way that fixes its identity in relation to the surveyor. So the subject here also has its identity formed or constructed to a certain extent by the observer, by the colonial power. Okay? And the imperial gaze defines the identity of the subject, objectifies it within the identifying system of power relations, and confirms its subalternity and powerlessness. Okay, this is exactly what Israel is doing in Gaza, and to a certain extent also on the West Bank. This is exactly what Bughi Ya'alon, who was chief of staff, said when he was talking about searing the consciousness of Palestinians. Okay, changing the way they think, changing the way they relate to themselves, and changing the way they relate to the colonial authorities or the occupying authorities. How does surveillance and control expressed in Gaza? Well, first of all, you have biometric ID and ID cards, which were originally used to control entrance and exit from the Aris checkpoint for Gazans working within Israel proper. Census data is extremely popular with the Israeli army. During Cast-led and other operations, one of the first targets is census data. Okay, they certainly destroyed the census offices in Ramallah, and absconded with tons and tons of data. Okay, you have the physical elements of control checkpoints, the Aris crossing. Has anybody been through the Aris crossing recently? No, just the tunnels. The Aris crossing today looks very much like an airport. Okay, it's built to look like an airport. I mean, it's clean, it's sterile. Okay, it's shiny. You expect to see duty-free shops. It's an entry point between two sovereign countries. Very modern, very well done. Israel also built a huge bomb shelter underneath the checkpoint.
The first thing you go through is customs.
Yeah, this is what it looks like. It looks nice, doesn't it? It certainly doesn't look like Alandi, and it doesn't look like any other checkpoints that Israel has set up. But what struck me, I was there, I managed to get in through a favor. I couldn't take any pictures. This I downloaded from the government website. What struck me though was the architecture itself. Okay, the Palestinians and the Israelis throughout the checkpoint itself are physically separated. There's absolutely no point of contact, physical contact between the Gazans and the Israelis controlling the checkpoint. In other areas, guards patrol on gangwalks. Okay, they're not on the same level, so it keeps them above the people. So yeah, it's nice and it's air conditioned. It's all about control. It's all about control, and you see it through the technology that's used within the network. You'll see in a second, and you can see it in the architecture of the checkpoint itself. So you have the errors crossing, Web 2 implementation, Facebook, etc. This is something what researchers call the participatory Panopticon. This is information we give about ourselves. Okay, throughout all these Web 2.0 sites, Facebook, etc. We volunteer information about ourselves. We map out our social relations, okay, for the world to see. Okay, and this is generally the first thing that intelligence agencies look for when they arrest someone, when they stop somebody. They want to map out your social relationships, and here we are giving it to them on a silver platter, which is why it's participatory Panopticon. This is information that we give about ourselves, okay, without thinking twice, usually about where the information goes and how it's being used. By the way, most of you probably aren't aware of this, but at a lot of border crossings today, even if you have a visa, people will look you up. The border control people will look you up on Facebook or check you out on Google. Okay, so a lot of times it's also information that you didn't put out there, but maybe somebody else did about you. Okay, this happens in the States, it certainly happens in Canada, and it's being used by a lot of countries to expand or extend their sovereignty beyond their own borders. Okay, the U.S. has been doing this for quite some time. So that's in terms of participatory Panopticon. Israel also makes use of surveillance zeppelins. It's the picture that you saw before. Yes, it's innocent and it's not as small as it looks. I just couldn't get any closer to it. These zeppelins apparently contain hardware that allows Israel to take control of cellular networks, to monitor cellular networks, to take those networks down, and also monitor internet traffic. Okay. More and more you see these being used in Israel proper during visits of heads of state. So if you have people coming to Jerusalem, you see this balloon go up over Jerusalem, over the area where that head of state or that person is visiting, and they have the ability to shut down all communications from that zeppelin. Okay, as well as monitoring information. Control of telephony and cellular communications. The Palestinian Authority gets most of its bandwidth from Israel, through Israel. It's controlled by Israel. Okay. In Gaza now, there is some bandwidth provided by Egypt, but it's minor. It's not significant. Okay, so most of it comes through Israel, which means that Israel has the ability also through packet inspection to actually see the information that's coming in and going out of the Gaza Strip, and through the West Bank for that matter. In the West Bank, they use the control of telephony and cellular communication also to create a situation that favors Israeli service providers, by the way, at the expense of Jawal and the other Palestinian providers, okay, in terms of putting out the cellular towers, etc. So it's not just land, it's also control of spectrum, it's also control of magnetic spectrum. Most of the internet bandwidth is provided by Israeli providers, allowing for control and monitoring. UAV drones, okay, for attack and surveillance. Over the last couple of months, drone technologies has become actually quite prominent in the press with discussion of them because they're being used now or being adopted within civilian frameworks. Police departments in the U.S., particularly along the border with Mexico, are making use of drones, okay, to follow illegal immigration, what they see as illegal immigration. The U.S. is making use of drones and made use of drones in Iraq and underneath Afghanistan for both attack and surveillance. The UK is as well. Israel manufactures most of the drones in the drone market, especially the attack drones. So they also have a vested interest, a vested economic interest, and I'll touch on that later. Israel also developed remote control in the robotic gun towers. Two different types. So these can be used on complete automatic. In other words, the computer recognizes an image, it analyzes that image, decides whether that image is suspicious or not. If it is suspicious, the gun can open fire automatically by itself. The system can open fire automatically by itself. How do you define suspicious behavior? That's a good question. Okay, these systems are used In the UK and in the US, not as gun towers so much, but for trying to identify suspicious behavior in the streets. Okay, they're fused together. Someone in a car park standing next to a parked car. Okay, going around it, moving around, it could be construed as suspicious behavior. Okay, so then the computer system would then call somebody here. In this case, it doesn't call somebody, it opens fire. And of course, you also have the remote control towers where the operators, usually women, use a joystick and cameras to control the gun and can fire at will. Okay, at any time, at any target. Okay, this is what happens when a Gazan does get actually the Israeli soldier. This was photoshopped in later, and I also think it's a cardboard cutout. I've seen this picture in too many places. The operator actually sits on the other side. There is no one in the room with the person being identified. And you can see that the identification has a number of levels. It takes place at a number of levels. You have the magnetic biometric ID card, which you use, which is the first level of identification. There's an optical scanner here, which scans the iris, okay, and the face to match those points of biometric data. There's a fingerprint reader here, which reads all 10 fingerprints, not just one. Okay, plus a palm reader. Okay, that kind of system, it's redundant in a number of ways. I mean, it's impossible to fool a system like that unless you can actually hack into the database and change both the information, which is encrypted, the information in the database and the information in the card. Both are encrypted, it's impossible to change. It's very, very difficult. So this is the process that they use in order to enter Israel to work. And you see these implementations now. Again, this isn't working in Gaza, but you certainly see it at the checkpoints in the West Bank. Not at this level, but certainly at other levels. Another thing that they use is the RFID readers. When people go through the checkpoints, you may not be aware of this, but most of our cell phones have RFID chips in them. And if the security services are interested in you, they'll make sure to get the identification number of that RFID chip, and they can follow you as you go through the checkpoints in the West Bank. Okay, because it automatically reads the information off of the RFID chips. If you're tagged in the system, it'll come up automatically, and you don't have to do anything. Another technology that was developed in the territories and is being used today both in Israel and abroad is facial recognition. Activists used to think that we had anonymity in numbers. Okay, when we went to a demonstration, we weren't worried about being identified on any way, because there were a lot of people there. How can they possibly identify all of us in a hectic situation? Well, they can. They developed facial recognition technology, which they run against the National Register of Citizens, which includes pictures, and they can actually match the face in a demonstration to an ID number and then pull up all the relevant information, name, address, etc. Biometric and smart ID cards are also seeping into Israeli society. This is being implemented now as a pilot project. But most people that are arrested today by the police, even for little stupid things like graffiti or things like that, like my son was, they take biometric data from the people that are arrested. Okay? Again, to create this database, even though legally it's just in the pilot stage. Use of UAVs in civilian context, we see this in the States. You don't see it so much in Israel unless it's being run by Iran or Hezbollah. But I assume that we will see more of this in Israel proper, and certainly more of this in the US and other countries. Development of surveillance trojans. Examples of ghost net flame. Neither of these are necessarily surveillance trojans, they're Trojan horses. But Israel has also been working on developing surveillance trojans. In other words, trojans that end up in someone's computer, say the Kenyon Institute, which would provide the operator with control and access to everything on that PC, including the ability to turn on the camera, microphone, etc. I've seen these. I saw GhostNet, which was developed by the Chinese for use against the Tibetans, Actually, I saw this work. It's amazing. You get an interface and you just click, turn on the camera, and you turn on the camera on the other end of the computer that's been infected with this Trojan. Turn on the mic. Obviously, you can go through the hard drive, add information, take away information. It's really quite impressive. So this is also going on, and my feeling is, since the slope is so intense, steep in terms of seepage, that this is going to expand. We'll be hearing more and more of this in the coming years. The use of surveillance zeppelins in a civilian environment. Okay, people were used to seeing these zeppelins on the border with Gaza, on the northern border, maybe sometimes along the border with Egypt. Now they see it within Israel proper. And once the technology becomes viable, I assume that they'll start marketing it as well. Because over 300 Israeli companies are involved in homeland security sector, many of which are based on technologies developed by the IDF. It's simple enough to map out where the founders of Israeli startups began their careers. Most of their careers began within the intelligence community, developing control and surveillance technologies. Okay, within one specifically in the mid 8200. When they get out of the army, they join the civilian sector and they take something that a lot of this stuff hasn't been patented, so they develop it within a civilian context. Surveillance and control methodologies in general, airport technology, questions that are asked at the airport, did you pack this by yourself, etc. The screening processes at the airport were developed in Israel and sold abroad as a methodology, and marketed abroad as a methodology. And I'm sure you've come across a lot of these seemingly ridiculous questions asked you by TSA employees, particularly when flying in the States. Have you noticed that the TSA or the U.S. has expanded its sovereignty through the TSA to other countries? Have you noticed that they have representatives in most airports in the world? No? Well, they do. It's the behavior of an empire. What? It's the behavior of an empire.
In Toronto, it's the same.
Yeah.
You go through American passport control in Toronto.
Yeah.
If you're flying to the States, just like as if you were going through El Al.
Mm-hmm. But you'll see also in Europe as well, you'll see TSA people giving orders to people in terms of what they're doing. The snowstorms in Europe a couple of years ago, I spent a hell of a lot of time stuck at the airport. And I saw TSA people with TSA tags from the U.S. giving orders to national airlines about how the security checks should be done, who should be targeted, and who should be focused on, etc. So it gives them the ability, the technology also supplies the ability to extend your sovereignty, okay, beyond your state, control what's going on beyond the borders. Okay, this is this aspect is very important. I go into it a little bit more detail in the paper itself, but the political economy aspect here is huge. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made. There is a lot of money to be made in the homeland security market, the security market. The U.S. does something like $30 billion a year outsourcing to companies working in these areas. And a lot of these are Israeli companies or companies joint U.S.-Israeli companies. It's a lot of money, and there's a difference between the new house prices and old house prices. There's also a difference between technologies that have been tested in the battlefield, so to speak, okay, and those that just came off the drawing board or came out of the lab and are being used in a civilian context. The price that can be charged, okay, for technologies that are tested in the battlefield, and this is what Gaza is essentially, is a testing ground for a lot of these technologies. Okay, so the price can go up, it's been tested. People have gone so far as to claim is that the Iron Dome system that Israel developed against rockets. Israel initiated the last military invasion of Gaza in order to showcase this technology, in order to show the world that this works. Okay, basically to drive up the stocks of the product. Okay, some conclusions. Anthony Giddens notes that aspects of totalitarian rule will threaten all advanced society, precisely because surveillance is maximized in the modern state. This he said in 1985. Almost 30 years later, the danger is greater. I'm a political scientist and I'm a political activist. And I've been dealing with technology for quite some time. But I think that Giddens is right, but I also think that the modern state in general cannot afford not to have access to certain data in terms of planning and stuff like that. I mean, taxes, raising an army, that's the two reasons why countries started counting its citizens, or keeping track of its citizens hundreds of years ago. This expanded, of course, right? If you need to provide education, so you need to know how many young couples are living there, how many kids they have on average, and how many kids are going to be in the school system in 6, 7, 8, 10 years. Okay? You need to be able to collect information to plan. Okay? So in that sense, the collection of information or surveillance within the modern state is natural and it's accepted. Okay, but the technology today allows us to create massive, to collate massive amounts of data about everything that we do. Okay, and this is something that's changed, and it's very tempting for the state to use it, whether it's Israel, whether it's the United States, whether it's any other liberal democracy. The slope is very, it's very slippery and it's extremely steep. The Gaza Strip, the world's largest open-air prison, is a living example of path to pan-spectral control, and it also serves as a testing ground for new technologies. Technologies are then exported and implemented in other areas. Well, it worked in Gaza. Okay, so it'll certainly work on the U.S.-Mexico border. It'll work on the Canadian border with the U.S. We can use these. We can use these drones. We can use these technologies. We can use these methodologies. Used by the IDF of postmodern theory and approaches in warfare and surveillance. I also discuss this in a little bit more detail in the paper itself. During the various incursions of Israel into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, militaries around the world have held the IDF's use of unique ways of managing the fight. And it's even being imitated to a certain extent by the U.S., certainly through connections at the U.S. Army War College and other places. They're actually using postmodern theory to accomplish a lot of this. It's sort of like this thinking out of the box at the IDF, but no, it's primarily postmodern thinking. And a lot of the officers, the senior officers involved in creating these methodologies, admit that they've taken a lot of ideas from postmodern thought. So that's interesting, the fact that it's coming and actually helping the imperial forces strengthen themselves. I think further on down the line, and this is a serious thing to say, but unfortunately I feel that it's true, I think that there's a danger of collapse of the liberal democratic construct because of the use of technology, or due to the use of technology. It's just too tempting. It's just too tempting. I don't know what's going to become, what will show up in the future. I'm not particularly optimistic, but certainly liberal democracy, the concept of liberal democracy is being shaken by the use of technologies for surveillance and for control. And I think that's a real danger. Aside from the fact of what's going on a day-to-day basis in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, there's a larger danger here of this technology being used in order to shape and control people everywhere. Thanks.